Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk about something that I and my team are extremely passionate about, and that is IBM's jams. I realize we're right after lunch, so I'll do my best not to put you to sleep, so I'll try my best as we go through. I wanted to start very quickly with a little clip for you to watch, and I'm going to talk about this as we look up at the screen here. The map we're looking at was created by IBM Research, and the individual lights showing up on the screen recognize the 250,000 IBMers as they were posting in our online jam. And back in January, Ginny talked about bringing together IBM population to talk about our iconic behaviors. How do we live up to our goal of being essential to our clients? And at one point in time, we had over 48,000 people online at the same time jamming together on this notion of creating our behaviors. Back in July, Ginny Rometty, our CEO, announced the 9 behaviors that were created as a result of analyzing over 170,000 posts that were contributed by the 250,000 IBMers, where they shared their stories, their passion, their ideas about how do we make this real? How do we become essential to our clients and in our communities? In fact, 10 years ago, 2003, we actually created our values together. So you see here up on the screen, we have our 3 values: dedication to every client success, innovation that matters to IBM in the world, and trust and responsibility in everything we do. We created these values as a community, as IBMers, back in 2003 through this notion of a jam. In July, Ginny announced the 9 practices that we created. And what was interesting is we were calling these behaviors. What were the 9 behaviors? And we found from doing some analysis on looking at the demographics who participated in our jam of IBMers that for our millennial population, the term behavior really didn't sit well. They didn't like the notion of behavior, whereas no other demographic really worried about that term. So we actually changed the terminology in what Ginny announced as our 9 practices as a result. What is this thing I've been calling a jam? Because I'm with IBM, I often get asked the question, well, what's the acronym? What does JAM stand for? And it's actually not an acronym for anything. You've probably guessed already, or you might already know, that we took the word jam from jamming and jazz musicians. We love the notion of the fact that jazz musicians are passionate about their music. They can come together in a physical environment, even if they've never met before. They can come together, their passion for their music, they can create something absolutely amazing. And we thought, how could we recreate that environment in an online fashion within IBM? This was back in 2001 when we first ran our first jam called World Jam, and we were looking at ways of bringing together the company to think about culture and culture change, this notion of creating one IBM. How do we use the size of IBM as an asset rather than looking at it as a liability? How do we tap into that culture and passion that people have for where they work? So the notion of the jam was creating an event, and we've always thought about jams as an event, not something that is an ongoing community. We're very familiar with things like Facebook nowadays and wikis and blogs that continue to live on and on, but an event is a very specific time period, usually 3 or 4 days, where you harness the creativity and passion of your audience around a specific topic that's being led at the most senior levels. And it's this event-like nature that really gets people excited. And you think about a jam and the whole preparation for what you would do in preparing for a jam event, like you were preparing a physical event, such as this. What's all the work that goes into identifying the topics, the content, the speakers, the guests, the audience that we want to invite? It's the same notion behind the jam. Sometimes jams have been referred to as a form of crowdsourcing, and I agree with that. Crowdsourcing, as we probably know within this audience, and its most general statement is, if you go out to a large enough audience somewhere, someone will have the answer. Law of averages are on your side. Jamming with an IBM has been where we go out to an invited audience because of their passion around a topic. We want to get their input, their perspectives and stories. If you're going to go through this effort of creating an event, a jam, getting everyone excited, you have to make sure you understand that your content and your topic is relevant to your audience. You also need to make sure that you can communicate quickly after the jam what you're going to do with this. There's a great quote by our former CEO, Sam Palmisano, who talked about if you're going to do a jam within a company or across an organization, you have to be prepared to do something with the outcome, as we can all imagine. When you go out and you ask people their opinion, but then you don't listen to the answer, or you don't show that you've listened and do something as a result. It's through both human facilitation through the jam event itself, as well as through the use of text and visual analytics that help us really understand what's going on in this discussion, so that we can perhaps influence the conversation while it's live, and certainly helps us go through this very large times massive amounts of content like our client experience jam, where we had over 175,000 posts that we needed to be able to sift through. As you saw up on the screen, almost 200 novels worth of content created in a 4-day period. Not just within IBM's four walls, but across other clients, but across industries, we've started engaging in the use of jams. And one of the things that we found, sort of a simple truth, is that we found regardless of the company, the industry, etc., is people are passionate about where they live and where they work. And they want to have a meaningful impact in influencing for a better end for where they live and work. And we found that the jam is a very productive, meaningful way of tapping into those communities. There's lots of examples up here on the screen that you can see about different types of communities that we're connected with. One of our earliest jams back in 2005 was with the UN, the World Urban Forum, for their Habitat Jam. To use the UN's term, we were connecting slum dwellers in some of the poorest parts of the world. We connected them online by setting up physical kiosks to allow them to be able to tell their stories about trying to find drinkable water, about safety, issues of transportation, etc. Being able to connect them online with policymakers, with mayors and government officials. And as a result of that conversation, an action plan, an agenda was created. And that's a key thing we always say about any jam, is how do you connect people in a meaningful conversation and then do something with it as a result? We've connected cities, we've connected neighborhoods with Cov Jam in the UK, connecting citizens with the mayor and city council to talk about, in a strapped environment financially, what do we do with limited resources? How do we draw people into the city? How do we expand tourism? What are simple ideas that maybe don't cost a lot of money that we can share and build out and think through what we're doing? We did a jam for the city of Zurich. It was called Stadtdebatte, city debate to translate it, where citizens got together to talk about the future of Zurich, a very sustainable city which is starting to grow outside of its boundaries within the valley that it occupies. What are some ideas and ways that the city could continue to grow in a more sustainable fashion? So we've some fascinating interactions with people from all facets of life that we've engaged with. I want to, given our conversation today is around education, I wanted to give a couple of examples of how we've used jams in a university setting. The first I'd like to talk about very briefly is an event we did called NPC Jam. NPC stands for National Planning Commission. The National Planning Commission was created by President Zuma of South Africa in order to engage in a year-long conversation, a discourse with the nation around their Vision 2030. And what were the different elements of this plan that the President and the Council, the members of Parliament, the government needed to adopt in order to move the country forward. And there was a conversation around, well, how do we engage the nation's youth in a forum or a medium that would be of most appealing to them, outside of the traditional town hall type setting? So we organized a jam, the NPC Jam, in order to connect students, university students across South Africa, in this conversation around what does the Vision 2030 mean to them? What does it mean to be growing up in South Africa? What are the plans? What are the issues that are of top of mind to them? And not surprisingly, outside of topics of infrastructure and jobs, education was the major theme that came through loud and clear for university students. And within that, we were able to distill very core thoughts around improvements for teachers in education and the access to training that teachers had to be able to bring to their students. Being able to identify for students who said we need to have better instruction within our universities about entrepreneurship and being able to set up small businesses, to be successful as a small business. How do we do that with a thriving population within South Africa? So it's fascinating ideas and conversations. Thousands of individuals participated in that particular jam. Very specific, concrete ideas were then captured and put into the plan that was presented to President Zuma about a year and a half later. Many of the ideas pulled directly through what the students had shared as part of their conversation. There's a great quote here by Trevor Manuel. He was our sponsor who had been appointed by President Zuma to run the Jam, and he talked about this notion of active citizenship and the way that we can use technology today to connect people to be a part of the conversation and be active citizens. A very recent example that I wanted to share with you second is with the University of South Australia, or UniSA is their acronym. I have a very new Vice Chancellor and President, David Lloyd, who joined in January. And he wanted to look at the institution, think about the future of the institution and where it needed to head in the next 3 to 5 years. And he wanted to not just engage with the board, the alumni board, but also to engage with the population, the ecosystem of the university, the city in which it lived, the students, the faculty, and the alumni. Engage them in a conversation around where is UniSA headed? Where should it go? As a university, it's actually quite a new school. It's roughly 25, maybe 28 years old, so it's not old by university standards. And they want to compete with some of the top universities within Australia. And they understand where they sit today, where do they need to go, and how are they going to get there. They had thousands of individuals participate, coming online in a structured conversation through the Jam, alumni, faculty, staff, and students, to engage in this conversation. Fully 25% of the posts that were contributed were by students, which was a real key signal of success. But they wanted to ensure that if we're going to have this Jam, we want to hear from all the stakeholders, but primarily we do want to hear from students. Sometimes, as we know, it can be hard to capture students' attention, capture their imagination, particularly if there's studies and exams and many other things pulling on distractions, pulling their attention. I think UniSA did a fantastic job because they looked at the complete social environment in which they were engaging in conversations. So not only were they going the traditional route of getting press in the paper, on the Australian, the national paper, around the impact of crowdsourcing, strategy, strategic planning in education, which is a relatively new concept. They were also engaged in Facebook to operate where the students were operating, engaged heavily in Twitter. In fact, we brought the tweets into the Jam itself so that people could see the conversations that were going on outside of the Jam environment and connect the two conversations. In fact, over the 2.5 days of the Jam, the Unijam hashtag, and for those of you who tweet, you can certainly go do a search on the Unijam hashtag, was actually trending, was the top trending tweet within Adelaide. And it brought tremendous attention as another form of communication vehicle between the institution and the students. And they even had some fun with the idea. You see down here, David Lloyd, he looks like a student here. You know, they had some jam donuts that they were eating, and they had pizza parties. And they had signs saying, don't be a jammy dodger, which for those of you who aren't English or Australian, a jammy dodger is a biscuit or a cookie with jam in the middle. And if you're a jammy dodger, it's someone who you're sort of maybe shirking your responsibilities. So a lot of play and fun on the words of really getting students intrigued and excited and sort of wondering what this whole thing was. A tremendous event. But as the saying goes, the proof is in the pudding. Today, UniSA announced the strategic plan as a result of the conversations that occurred in the Jam. So I would encourage all of you, when you have some time, to go to unisa.edu.au and take a look at what's being called Crossing the Horizon, the plan that's been laid out by the Vice Chancellor and the staff, which has these 7 core action steps with some very specific ideas and plans that developed as a result of the conversation that occurred in the Jam. During the conversations, during the discussion, you see down here at the bottom of the page, we have this Wordle. For those of you familiar with the terminology, it's simply the size of the word represents the repetition or strength of that word in the conversation. So a simple Wordle, and we see this word McGill, this whole conversation that came up in the Jam around what to do with the McGill campus within UniSA. There was considerable conversation about closing the campus. As a result of the discussion that occurred within the event, not only is McGill going to stay open, but the Vice Chancellor, as part of the strategic plan, has talked about it being the epicenter of what he calls the revolution in teacher education, being the core focus of this campus and education. So some tremendous ideas that came as a result of the jam. And it's not always far-reaching ideas. They can span from very simple ideas where people have a frustration or share a thought or idea, all the way to connecting the dots around ideas and passions that people have around moving something forward, making it better. I leave you with this thought. As we talk about education, the future of education, and the notion of jamming, the idea of crowdsourcing, the impact that will have on not only institutions of higher learning and education planning, but also the notion of learning and delivery of education within organizations and across institutions. And how do you bring your ecosystem into that equation? Thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you something that my team and I are very passionate about, IBM's jams. Thank you very much.